All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my friend Lisa Graves. Lisa is the executive director for the Center for Media and Democracy, which you can find at prwatch.org. You can also find her on Twitter at the Lisa Graves. Lisa, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Oh, Matt, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
All right, so Lisa, for starters, Center for Media and Democracy have been doing consistently amazing work with their ALEC Exposed series and website. Just amazing stuff. Last week, ALEC celebrated its 40th anniversary in my previous city, Chicago, Illinois. Before we get to the ALEC at 40, I actually want to get to some of the protests at the Chicago party that ALEC threw, where activists were arrested. And I've seen video where they were frankly abused by Chicago police. Tell us actually what happened at these protests.
Well, I think that there were a series of protests, and what we saw starting Monday, right before the conference began, was that one of the outgrowths of the Moral Mondays movement that began in North Carolina showed up at the hotel early to basically serve notice that the American people within Illinois and surrounding areas basically wanted to make sure people knew that ALEC was there and what ALEC was up to was no good.
No, absolutely, and clearly the ALEC is up to no good. You look at how it really is, again, like a shame, because it reminds me back to some of the Occupy protests that happened with Occupy Chicago, where Chicago police really were treating people who were just using their First Amendment rights of speech. Obviously up in Madison, Wisconsin, you guys will know a lot with Scott Walker, how actually protests are dealt with. It really was kind of disheartening to see police, taking protesters and abusing them that way.
Well, that's right. So on Monday, the arrests or the, putting people in the plastic handcuffs appeared to proceed nonviolently. But then later in the week, on Thursday, when we saw nearly 3,000 people come out to stand up and speak out against ALEC, that's when you saw the police presence, dramatically increase, and also the use of force was quite extraordinary, I have to say. What we saw from the video and from what my team saw that was on the ground there in Chicago, not to make a pun, saw people literally being thrown to the ground.
Yeah.
And I think that video is disturbing. The scenes of police, literally throwing people on the hard asphalt, on the hard cement there. People who were merely just speaking up, just in some instances just standing there in solidarity against ALEC. I thought that sort of brutality was really inappropriate, and I think it's disturbing. It should be disturbing for any American to see other Americans who are exercising their fundamental First Amendment rights, who are not engaged in violent activity, being treated in that way, being mistreated by the law enforcement officers who are actually supposed to be protecting and serving the citizens.
Absolutely, and not protecting and serving ALEC. But let's actually get to what those activists were protesting, what those citizens were protesting. As I said at the beginning, actually, Center for Media and Democracy has a really an amazing new report called ALEC at 40, Turning Back the Clock on Prosperity and Progress. And again, it's really hard this is something that kind of the progressive movement is just kind of getting their heads around, the fact that ALEC has been around for so long. Kind of describe the history, because it really, when you look at what ALEC has accomplished for the cause of evil, in my opinion, it's pretty staggering.
Well, our view obviously is ALEC at 40, there's nothing to celebrate, quite frankly. They've been a destructive force in terms of American public policy in countless ways. And as part of our new research into some of the terrible legislation that they've been behind that really is devastating to American workers and to American families, we took a look back to their origins. And part of that research is in this report. But what we know from our research is that ALEC was started by a number of legislators who had ties to the John Birch Society, which is an extremist group in the United States. It continues to exist, but it was notorious for its objection to the civil rights movement, its belief that even Dwight Eisenhower was somehow under the influence of communism. That was actually a charge that was leveled by Fred Koch in a brochure that he printed. Fred Koch is the father of David and Charles Koch, who would later start funding ALEC. But at the early days, the Kochs weren't there. What we learned from our research was that in the early 1970s, a number of very conservative state politicians in Illinois, including Henry Hyde, a much younger Henry Hyde, and others were gathering together because they thought the Republican Party that elected Richard Nixon was basically not conservative enough. They thought that it was essential to create a new organization, and these very right-wing legislators at the time, I think, were taking a page from what many have learned through other investigations that others have done, is a page from the playbook that was authored by one of the men who became a Supreme Court justice, the Powell memo, Lewis Powell, who was a lawyer for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He issued a secretive memo on behalf of the U.S. Chamber, basically, and the business interests of the U.S. Chamber, basically saying that the right and the corporations needed to form a new infrastructure in this country, and that infrastructure needed to change the dialogue, change the discourse, and push back against what was happening in government. What was happening in government was that people power was rising. Notwithstanding the results of any particular presidential election in the 1968 race or 72 race, the fact is that the government, the legislatures, had many members who were listening to citizens about restraining corporations, about making sure that our water could get cleaned up that had been so heavily polluted by corporations that I think even the Susquehanna River caught fire. Rivers were filled with hazardous waste. There was concern about our air. There was concern about products. Ralph Nader's tremendous work exposing the car companies in terms of the safety and their disregard for the safety of Americans and for the sake of profits. And so these corporations wanted to help seed conservative groups, pro-corporate groups, and ALEC came out of that. And so what we did in our report was document one of their very first meetings that was held in Chicago nearly 40 years ago. And at that meeting, they gathered together at a club that was like the Playboy Club. It's called the Gaslight Club, with girls and women, I should say, in little bodysuits, basically,
right.
With a bunch of legislators. And in those photos that we obtained, we saw, one of the lead men for the NRA, the leader of the Heritage Foundation, and other, which was recently founded in response to the Powell memo at that time, and numerous other politicians, including the man who is now United States Congressman Sensenbrenner.